Thank you so much for joining us for this video series. My name is Mary Weller, and this is Dr. Peter Jones from Truth Exchange. And we wanted to introduce to you the video series that you'll be watching today, Gay Identity in the Gospel. This series was recorded here in Escondido, California several months ago during a conference that we put on called The Two Loves, a Biblical Response to Gay Christianity. Dr. Jones, as the director of Truth Exchange, I'm wondering if you can tell our viewing audience why you felt this particular conference, this particular subject was so timely and important for right now.
Thank you, Mary. I just felt that given the situation which we find ourselves in today, that we needed to think through a form of discourse that would be biblically valid and yet not hateful and bigoted. And the Lord has given us in Truth Exchange a sort of hermeneutic or principle of interpretation that allows us, I think, to get to the very ground zero of where Christians should start thinking, and that was what we tried to do in this conference.
Right, right. Now, I know for some of you watching, you probably are thinking of situations or have started watching this series for situations that a lot of us have experienced here at Truth Exchange and within our church family. I'm thinking of people who have been raising children in the church and had a son or a daughter come out as gay. I'm thinking of people who have gone online to find out more about the debate that's happening within our culture and encountered not just stories of people coming out, but actually an entire theology in support of what we have termed gay Christianity. Dr. Jones, can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, it's true that it's easy to think that the problem is simply Christians who discover they're gay, and that's all we need to deal with. Right. It is an important subject, but it is the fact that what is developing today is actually, you might call, a gay theology.
Right.
Which underlines a whole new view of what it means to be a church and to be a Christian. And so we felt that we needed to address that much larger subject.
And so as you talk about how much larger it is, I know that at our conference we had several speakers who are going to be represented on this series. And can you talk about some of the different items that they touched on and how those are sort of encompassed in a whole, the way that we designed this conference and the way that we've designed this series?
Yeah, we are producing 3 discs, 3 different groups of lectures. The first couple of lectures were dealing with the essential issues, the beginning issues, if you like. Dr. Michael Brown, who is a journalist and TV personality, radio host,
yes,
and fine author and scholar, came and gave 2 lectures. One on this approach to the Bible that gay Christianity as a movement is developing, and he was quite convincing in showing that. But his second lecture was to completely deconstruct that kind of an argumentation and show that it was impossible to actually use the Bible to defend gay Christianity. So his lectures were fundamental, brilliant, and really everyone needs to hear those. Dr. Gabe Fleurer is a Christian pastor in Jackson, Mississippi, and he gave an excellent sermon on what it means to follow the Bible's way of life in terms of sexual morals. Now, that's the first group. They can be watched as a particular form of study and for education purposes. The second lectures are those that I and Rosaria Butterfield give. Rosaria Butterfield is an absolutely brilliant thinker. She was a queer historian and lecturer at Syracuse University, and she was in a lesbian relationship, and she became a Christian. Now she is a wife and a mother, wife of a Christian pastor, and has become a thoroughgoing Christian. And she gives a wonderful lecture on what it means to know one's identity from the Bible and not from other forms and sources of identity. My first lecture was an attempt to show the difficulty, indeed the great problem that gay Christianity establishes in where it begins to think theologically. The problem is people begin with the suffering homosexual that we know, and we know people have experienced suffering and abuse, and it's very easy to be moved by the situation of these kinds of people.
Mm-hmm.
However, if you want to do theology, then you have to start somewhere else. And I took as the starting point what Jesus said. There are 2 commandments. He was asked what were the most important. He said the first and most important is that you shall love your Lord your God. And the second is love your neighbor as yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And so my first lecture was to show the danger of beginning with love of neighbor rather than love of God.
Yes.
And where that takes us. My second lecture was, what does it mean to love God? And how that informs the way we think about our own sexual identity in terms of heterosexuality as a reflection of the person of God in his being as Trinity.
I really appreciate about this series of lectures the fact that we do deal with individual issues, and I think that some of those are very important. There are arguments that we encounter them online, we encounter them in social media, we encounter them in the media and in our personal relationships that we do need to be able to speak to. But I think that as we deal with those, what Truth Exchange has to offer and what you've offered, especially through your lectures as sort of an umbrella over all of this, is that there is a comprehensive worldview that affects why the way that we think about our sexuality as human beings created in the image of God is so important. And so I'm excited about that structure, and I would encourage all of you as you watch to really follow through with us on this. Sometimes thinking about who God is might seem unrelated from how we think about and deal with those who struggle, excuse me, with the sin of homosexuality in practice or are struggling with same-sex desires. They might seem totally unrelated. And yet what we find is that they are utterly related. And I think that that is drawn out in this approach.
I think it becomes clear that once you deal with sexuality, which is the fundamental issue,
Right.
you're actually dealing with the question, what is the human being?
Yes.
And once you ask what is the human being, then you're forced to ask who is God.
Right.
And so you have to deal with the person of God in order to understand who we are as human beings. By the way, I didn't get to the third group of people
Yes.
we'll be lecturing, which are 3 wonderful people who give their personal testimonies about their experience of homosexuality and deliverance from it. Perhaps you could mention who they are, Mary.
Absolutely. And what we're dealing with here is not just those who have dealt with sexual brokenness in the form of homosexual desire, but other kinds of broken sexual desire. And that's the thing, is that all of us are sinners who are saved by grace. And so we have these wildly different stories from 3 different lovely men who are all connected because of their love of the Savior. And so first you'll be hearing from Stephen Black, who is the founder now of First Stone Ministries. He gives a wonderful lecture that involves not only his own personal testimony, but also stories about those whom he's worked with for the last 30 years of ministry, dealing with those who struggle with sexual brokenness. Jim Weidenar also gives a wonderful half-hour testimony about his work, his life, and his time with a group called Harvest USA, who minister to the sexually broken in the Philadelphia area, as well as...
Well, it's really a national ministry, but...
You're right, it is a national ministry. He, in particular, is in the Philadelphia area. And then Alan Edwards, who is a minister within our own denomination, the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America, who pastors in Philadelphia as well. And I loved having these men here, along with Rosaria, who are able to share their own personal experiences and whose lives have been absolutely transformed by the power of the gospel. And I think that that puts feet on what could otherwise seem like high-minded theology. Really, this is the most practical thing that we can be thinking about and talking about as Christians. And so we're so glad that you've joined us. And I hope that you benefit in the way that all of us have benefited who have already seen this content, and that we hear from you, that we get a chance to hear how this has helped you, what questions it's raised for you, and how it's touched your life. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Dr. Jones, for joining me today.
Perhaps I could just add,
Yes.
since it's close to my heart, that what we wanted to produce is a discourse that is at ground level for all Christians, dealing with this fundamental issue of who is man and who is God, which is not the result of bigotry or hatred,
Absolutely.
but a serious attempt to understand these major issues of God and ourselves as human beings. And I hope that people, as they listen to this, will find in these lectures a valid discourse for dealing with this volatile and important subject.
Well, and what you bring up is so important, because the moment that we as Christians open our mouths about a biblical view of sexuality, we are accused of bigotry and hatred.
That's right.
And yet what we find we're really dealing with is, what does true love look like?
That's right.
Often it's painful and it's sacrificial, and it means standing up for things that are hard because of the good of those around us, and because of, as you've qualified so beautifully, who God is and what he's called us to. And I'm glad that you brought out that point. Thank you.
Okay.